The old farmer had seen winters take lives before, but this time, he wasn't about to let it happen again. When he saw the tiny bear cub trembling in the snow, its fur matted with ice, eyes wide and desperate, he knew he had only minutes to decide. The nearest wildlife rescue was hours away. The frost was biting deep. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't walk away. The night settled heavy around the cabin, snow tapping softly against the window panes. The old farmer sat in his worn armchair, one hand resting on the armrest, the other holding a chipped mug of tea. Across from him, near the stove, the little bear cub slept, curled tight into the folds of the wool blanket. Every so often, the cub's sides rose and fell with uneven breaths. The farmer's eyes drifted toward it more often than he meant them to. Something about the small, helpless thing stirred a part of him that had been quiet for years. On the table beside him sat an old rotary phone. He'd thought about calling the ranger in town, but the snow was still coming down hard, and he knew the roads would be bad until morning. Besides, something in him resisted the idea of handing the cub over just yet. Not until it was stronger. He leaned forward, setting his mug down, and pulled the blanket a little higher over the cub's back. The firelight flickered across its fur, catching in the tiny droplets still clinging near its ears. In the quiet, his mind wandered back decades, back to a winter when he was a boy, and his father had found a stray dog half-frozen near the barn. He remembered how his father had carried it inside, fed it, kept it by the fire until it could stand on its own. That dog had lived with them for years, and when it died, it left a space in the house no one could fill. The cub shifted in its sleep, letting out a small, pitiful sound. The farmer reached out instinctively, resting a weathered hand gently on its side. The fur was warmer now, the trembling less pronounced. Hours passed like that, in the soft rhythm of fire crackles and wind howls. At one point, he dozed off in his chair, waking only when the cub let out a louder, almost startled noise. Its eyes were open now, blinking slowly, as if trying to place where it was. He rose, knees aching, and went to the kitchen. From the pantry, he found a small pot and poured in some more milk, warming it over the stove. He added a bit of honey, just a drop, before pouring it into the bowl again. This time, when he set it down, the cub drank eagerly, its little tongue darting in and out. "That's it," the farmer murmured softly, though he wasn't sure why he spoke aloud. His voice was gravelly from disuse, he didn't often have company to talk to. When the bowl was empty, the cub licked the last droplets from its muzzle and looked up at him. There was something in that look, not exactly trust, not yet, but the beginning of something like it. He sat back on the floor, leaning against the edge of the chair, and the cub, after a moment's hesitation, inched closer until it was near his leg. He could feel the heat of its small body even through the layers of his clothes. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters. The farmer stoked the fire again, feeding it more wood until the room was bathed in steady warmth. He glanced at the clock. Midnight had passed. He should sleep, but he didn't want to leave the cub alone. Instead, he pulled an old quilt down from the bed in the back room and laid it beside the stove. Then he stretched out there himself, boots off, hat pulled low over his brow. The cub watched him, then, as if deciding it was safe, it shuffled closer, curling up against his side. For the first time in years, the farmer felt something more than just the pull of routine. He felt needed. Morning would bring decisions, whether to call the ranger, whether the cub's mother might still be out there, but for now, in the gentle heat of the fire, those questions could wait. The night settled heavy around the cabin, snow tapping softly against the window panes. The old farmer sat in his worn armchair, one hand resting on the armrest, the other holding a chipped mug of tea. Across from him, near the stove, the little bear cub slept, curled tight into the folds of the wool blanket. Every so often, the cub's sides rose and fell with uneven breaths. The farmer's eyes drifted toward it more often than he meant them to. Something about the small, helpless thing stirred a part of him that had been quiet for years. On the table beside him sat an old rotary phone. He'd thought about calling the ranger in town, but the snow was still coming down hard, and he knew the roads would be bad until morning. Besides, something in him resisted the idea of handing the cub over just yet. Not until it was stronger. He leaned forward, setting his mug down, and pulled the blanket a little higher over the cub's back. The firelight flickered across its fur, catching in the tiny droplets still clinging near its ears. In the quiet, his mind wandered back decades, back to a winter when he was a boy, and his father had found a stray dog half frozen near the barn. He remembered how his father had carried it inside, fed it, kept it by the fire until it could stand on its own. That dog had lived with them for years, and when it died, it left a space in the house no one could fill. The cub shifted in its sleep, letting out a small, pitiful sound. The farmer reached out instinctively, resting a weathered hand gently on its side. The fur was warmer now, the trembling less pronounced. Hours passed like that, in the soft rhythm of fire crackles and wind howls. At one point, he dozed off in his chair, waking only when the cub let out a louder, almost startled noise. Its eyes were open now, blinking slowly, as if trying to place where it was. He rose, knees aching, and went to the kitchen. From the pantry, he found a small pot and poured in some more milk, warming it over the stove. He added a bit of honey, just a drop, before pouring it into the bowl again. This time, when he set it down, the cub drank eagerly, its little tongue darting in and out. "That's it," the farmer murmured softly, though he wasn't sure why he spoke aloud. His voice was gravelly from disuse, he didn't often have company to talk to. When the bowl was empty, the cub licked the last droplets from its muzzle and looked up at him. There was something in that look, not exactly trust, not yet, but the beginning of something like it. He sat back on the floor, leaning against the edge of the chair, and the cub, after a moment's hesitation, inched closer until it was near his leg. He could feel the heat of its small body even through the layers of his clothes. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters. The farmer stoked the fire again, feeding it more wood until the room was bathed in steady warmth. He glanced at the clock. Midnight had passed. He should sleep, but he didn't want to leave the cub alone. Instead, he pulled an old quilt down from the bed in the back room and laid it beside the stove. Then he stretched out there himself, boots off, hat pulled low over his brow. The cub watched him, then, as if deciding it was safe, it shuffled closer, curling up against his side. For the first time in years, the farmer felt something more than just the pull of routine. He felt needed. Morning would bring decisions, whether to call the ranger, whether the cub's mother might still be out there, but for now, in the gentle heat of the fire, those questions could wait. The pale light of dawn crept slowly through the frost-covered windows, painting the cabin in shades of silver and gold. The old farmer stirred first, his back stiff from the hard floor, but the warmth at his side made him hesitate before sitting up. The bear cub was still pressed against him, breathing softly, its tiny nose twitching with each exhale. For a moment, he simply watched it. In the morning light, its fur looked softer, less tangled with ice. The faint tremble in its body was gone. Carefully, he shifted so as not to wake it, then pulled himself to his feet. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world still and blanketed in white. He knew the ranger's office would open in a couple of hours, but something inside him resisted picking up the phone. The cub wasn't ready to be moved, not yet. Instead, he went to the stove, stoked the fire, and set a kettle of water on to boil. The smell of brewing coffee filled the air. He found himself glancing back at the cub every few minutes, as though afraid it might disappear if he looked away too long. When it finally stirred, blinking in the daylight, the farmer crouched nearby. "Morning," he said quietly, the word rough but strangely gentle. The cub shifted, stretching its front paws forward and yawning, a high-pitched, squeaky sound that made him chuckle. From the pantry, he pulled out another small pot, warmed milk again, and added just enough honey to coax the cub to drink. It came to the bowl more quickly this time, drinking with small, deliberate sips. Afterward, it licked its muzzle clean, then sat back on its haunches and looked at him. The stare was steady now, not fearful, but curious. The farmer reached out his hand slowly, palm up. The cub hesitated, then sniffed his fingers before nudging its head into his palm. The contact was brief but enough to send a small, unexpected warmth through his chest. After breakfast, he pulled on his boots and coat. "Gotta check the fences," he muttered, mostly to himself. He left the cub by the fire, half expecting it to stay put. But as soon as he opened the door, he heard small, deliberate steps behind him. He turned to see the cub at the threshold, nose lifted to the cold air. For a moment, he thought about shutting the door and keeping it inside, safe, warm. But something about the way it stood there, alert and watchful, told him it needed a taste of the outside world again. "All right," he said, stepping aside. The cub padded out onto the porch, its paws sinking into the snow. It sniffed the air, ears flicking at the distant caw of a crow. The farmer watched closely, ready to scoop it up if it showed signs of distress. But the cub moved slowly along the porch, investigating each post, before stopping at the top step and sitting down. The old man stepped into the yard, walking toward the fence line. He checked for fallen rails and tracks in the snow. Behind him, he could hear the cub moving in short bursts, trotting a few feet, then stopping to sniff the air. Near the edge of the field, he paused. Fresh prints, large, spaced wide apart, marked the snow. Bare tracks. Not the cub's. He crouched, tracing one with his glove. It was recent. Maybe a few hours old. His eyes moved toward the tree-line, searching for movement, but the woods stood silent. The cub padded up beside him, looking at the tracks. It didn't make a sound, but it sat very still, its eyes fixed on the forest. The farmer's mind turned over the possibilities. If the mother was alive, she might still be searching. If not, then these tracks belonged to something else entirely. They stayed there a moment longer, the cold settling in through his coat, before he finally stood. "Come on," he murmured, and the cub followed him back to the cabin. Inside, he stoked the fire again, then sat down heavily in his chair. The cub wandered the room a little now, its movements slow but deliberate, pausing to sniff the boots by the door and the corner where the woodpile sat. It was finding its place. The old farmer leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He still didn't know what the right thing to do was. But he knew one thing, he wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. The day unfolded slowly, the kind of winter day where the sun never truly climbs high, just hovers low and pale over the horizon. The farmer spent the morning splitting wood by the shed, his breath coming out in short clouds. Each time he paused, he could see the cub through the cabin window, watching him. When he went back inside, the warmth hit him like a blanket. The cub trotted toward him, still clumsy on its paws, but moving with more energy than the day before. It sniffed at his boots, then sat back on its haunches as if expecting something. "All right, you're hungry again," he muttered with a faint smile. He fetched the pot from the shelf, warmed more milk, and added another drop of honey. This time, when he set the bowl down, the cub drank greedily, its ears twitching with each lap. Afterward, it wandered over to the wood stove and sat close, the firelight dancing across its fur. The farmer took his seat in the armchair and studied it. "You're tougher than you look," he said under his breath. By mid-afternoon, the cabin felt too small. He decided to take the cub outside for a short walk, just along the edge of the field. He bundled himself in his coat, pulled his hat low, and stepped out into the crisp air. The cub followed eagerly, its small pawprints trailing his. The snow was deep in places, forcing the cub to hop forward, sinking up to its belly before scrambling free. The farmer kept a slow pace, letting it explore but never stray far. They reached the old fence line again. He checked the posts, noting the weight of the snow pressing them down. Beyond, the tree-line was quiet, but the memory of those large tracks still lingered in his mind. The cub sniffed the air suddenly, ears perking. It took a few slow steps toward the forest, its head tilting as if listening. The farmer stiffened, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved, but he could feel the weight of the silence pressing in. "Not today," he said, his voice firm but low. He turned back toward the cabin, and after a hesitant pause, the cub followed. Back inside, he hung his coat on the wall peg and crouched beside the cub. "You've got a nose for trouble, don't you?" The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet. He mended a tear in his coat sleeve, the cub curled nearby on the blanket. Occasionally, it would lift its head to watch him, those dark eyes tracking every movement. As dusk settled, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. The farmer lit the oil lamp, its glow softening the corners of the room. He prepared a simple dinner, thick stew from the pot he'd made the day before, and filled a small bowl for the cub, mixing in a little of the milk. It ate slowly, pausing between bites to glance at him, as if making sure he wasn't going anywhere. When the fire was stoked for the night, the farmer stretched out on the quilt beside the stove again. This time, the cub didn't hesitate, it walked right up, circled twice, and settled with its head against his arm. He lay there listening to the wind howl outside, the warmth of the little body beside him steady and grounding. He thought of the town a few miles down the road, of how folks there went about their lives unaware of this small life now resting in his cabin. And for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of connection, not just to the cub, but to something larger, something he couldn't name. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe the ranger would come. Maybe the cub's mother would appear out of the woods. But tonight, here in the flickering firelight, the farmer decided he'd protect it for as long as it needed. The next morning broke with a sky the color of steel. The air was so still it felt as though the whole valley was holding its breath. The farmer noticed it the moment he stepped onto the porch to bring in wood, the kind of silence that meant something was out there. The cub was sitting near the door, its head turning toward the forest, ears pricked forward. Its gaze was locked on a distant point past the field, as if it could hear something the old man couldn't. He narrowed his eyes at the tree-line. The forest stood dark and motionless, but he felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. "All right, let's keep close today," he muttered, more to himself than to the cub. Inside, he poured milk for the cub and brewed coffee for himself. He sat in his armchair, watching as the cub drank quickly, then paced restlessly near the door. Every so often, it would pause, listening. By midday, the farmer couldn't ignore it anymore. He pulled on his coat and boots. The cub darted forward as soon as the door opened, its small paws disappearing into the fresh snow. They didn't go far, just to the edge of the fence. The snow was deeper here, crunching beneath the farmer's boots with each slow step. He saw no new tracks, but that didn't ease the tight feeling in his chest. Halfway down the fence line, the cub froze. Its head turned sharply toward the woods, nose lifted, nostrils flaring. A moment later, the farmer heard it too, a faint crack of a branch, distant but distinct. He stood still, scanning the tree line. Then he saw it, movement, slow and deliberate, just beyond the first row of trees. A shape. Large. For a few seconds, he thought it might be the cub's mother. But as it stepped closer to the edge of the shadow, he saw the fur was darker, almost black, and the frame heavier than a female bear's. He didn't move. The cub stayed pressed against his boot, making no sound. The figure in the trees paused, head lowered, as though watching them. The farmer's pulse quickened. If it was another bear, male, it could be dangerous, even to the cub. He took one slow step backward, then another, keeping his eyes on the dark shape. The cub followed, its little paws leaving neat prints in the snow beside his. They made it back to the porch without the shape moving closer. The farmer ushered the cub inside, shutting the door firmly behind them. He stayed there for a long moment, hands still on the knob, listening. The rest of the afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. The cub seemed more alert than usual, lifting its head at every sound outside. The farmer chopped wood by the stove instead of going back out, keeping himself busy while the wind began to pick up again. As night fell, he made sure the shutters were closed tight. The fire burned strong, casting flickering light over the cabin walls. He laid out the quilt and sat down heavily, the cub curling against him almost immediately. Outside, the wind carried faint sounds, the creak of snow-laden branches, the far-off snap of ice shifting. But somewhere in the mix, the farmer thought he heard something heavier. Something moving. He rested a hand on the cub's back. "You're safe here," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince the cub or himself. The cub's breathing slowed, its warmth seeping through his shirt. Still, the farmer didn't sleep easily. His mind kept drifting to the dark shape in the woods and the unshakable feeling that they hadn't seen the last of it. The morning after the shadow in the woods felt different. The wind had died, but the cold was sharper, biting deeper into the air. Frost laced the inside corners of the cabin windows, curling in delicate, sharp patterns. The farmer rose before the sun, his mind still turning over the image of the dark shape. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake the cub, though it stirred when he stoked the fire. Its ears twitched at the sound of the wood crackling. He poured the cub's milk and set it near the blanket. This time, the little animal hesitated before drinking, its eyes darting toward the door as though it expected something to be waiting outside. The farmer felt it too, a kind of pressure in the silence, as though the snow itself was holding back sound. He decided not to go to the fence line today. Instead, he busied himself with chores around the cabin, mending a torn boot strap, sorting through the stack of firewood, checking the hinges on the shutters. But by mid-morning, the cub was restless. It paced from the stove to the door, then to the small window and back again. The farmer tried to distract it with a few strips of leather to paw at, but it kept returning to the same spot near the threshold. Finally, he sighed, put on his coat, and opened the door. "All right. But we stay close." The snow crunched underfoot as they stepped outside. The pale sun cast long, blue-tinted shadows across the yard. At first, everything looked untouched, just a smooth sheet of snow stretching toward the trees. Then the farmer saw them. Tracks large, heavy, pressed deep into the snow. They came from the tree-line and stopped about 20 yards from the cabin before turning back. He crouched, examining one of the prints. Fresh. Not more than a few hours old. His jaw tightened. He looked toward the forest, scanning the shadows between the pines, but saw nothing moving. The cub stood beside him, nose twitching, small body tense. It made a low, almost inaudible sound, not quite a growl, but close. The farmer straightened and guided the cub back toward the porch. He could feel its reluctance in the way it kept glancing over its shoulder at the trees. Inside, he shut the door and slid the heavy latch into place. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. He lit the oil lamp even though it was still daylight, the warm glow pushing back the cold creeping through the windows. He tried to settle into his chair, but his mind wouldn't rest. The tracks meant whatever had been in the woods was now coming closer, testing the distance, maybe. By late afternoon, the light outside had dulled to a dim gray. Snow began falling again, slow and deliberate, each flake catching in the fading light. The cub lay near the stove but lifted its head at every creak of the cabin. That evening, as the farmer was ladling stew into his bowl, the sound came, faint at first, then clearer. A heavy step. Then another. Snow compacting under weight. The cub stood instantly, ears forward, eyes locked on the door. The farmer set his bowl down without eating. He moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see out. For a moment, he thought the darkness was empty. Then he caught it, a shape moving at the far edge of the field, large and steady, heading toward the tree-line again. He let the curtain fall back into place, his heart thudding in his chest. Whatever it was watching. That night, he kept the fire burning hotter than usual and the shutters latched tight. The cub curled against him on the quilt, its body warm but tense. Long after the wind picked up and the fire settled into a low, steady burn, the farmer lay awake, listening for footsteps in the snow. The wind rose before midnight, a steady pressure that made the cabin timbers hum. The farmer fed 2 more logs to the stove and pressed each shutter latch to be sure. The cub lay rigid on the quilt, not asleep, head up, ears pricked like little dishes searching the room for meaning. Outside, snow hissed against the boards. Somewhere farther off, something heavy moved with the snow, not through it. He turned down the lamp and let the fire carry the light. In the half-dark the cabin flattened into simple shapes. He thought about the big tracks, the way they had stopped and turned as if measuring the distance to his porch. The first thud came as a tremor rather than a sound, a ripple through the floorboards. The cub rose, body low, nose lifting, mouth closed. The farmer reached for the iron poker and moved to the window. He parted the curtain with 2 fingers. Moonlight had found the field. Near the old fence a shape separated from the shadows and resolved into muscle, fur, breath. The bear's head swung toward the cabin. Steam roped from its nostrils. It took 2 heavy steps, then stopped and lifted its nose, tasting the air seeping through the doorframe. "Easy," the farmer whispered, unsure to whom. He backed from the window, set the poker down, and pulled a tin wash basin from under the table. When the bear moved again, snow compressing like wet cloth, he struck the basin hard with a wooden spoon. The sound knifed into the night. The shape froze, head high. he struck again, and the note rang colder. The cub pressed against his boot, trembling but silent. The bear paced along the fence, testing, then melted back into the darker trees. When nothing else moved, he set the basin down, hands shaking more than he liked. He did not sleep. He sat with the cub and watched the fire collapse to coals. The wind dropped. A different quiet settled, the kind that leaves fresh tracks. By daylight, the world had edges again. He opened the door carefully and scanned the yard. New prints stitched the snow near the fence and curved toward the tree line. A warning or a test? He poured warm milk and watched the cub drink, then made a decision that felt like opening a gate he could not close. The road to town might be passable with a hand sled. The phone lines were dead from the last storm. Waiting for help felt like inviting something to knock. He would go in today, get formula, blankets, advice, a plan. He would put the cub where people could see it, and whatever came of that would come. He dragged the old sled from the shed and lashed a milk crate to its slats with baling twine. He lined the crate with a folded jacket and the smoke-scented wool blanket. The cub stepped in, turned once, and lay down with its head on the rim, eyes on him. He looped the rope around his waist and tested the pull until the sled slid. The road bent along the river, patched with drift and hardpack. He leaned into the harness and let the rhythm of effort clear the night from his mind. Every few minutes he glanced back. The cub rode steady, ears forward, nose sampling the air. 2 miles on, the first farmhouse appeared, roof hunched under snow. Mrs. Hargreaves stepped onto her porch in a red wool hat, saw the crate, and lifted a hand to her mouth. "Lord above," she said when he reached the gate. "Is that what I think it is?" "It's a cub," he answered. "Found it near my north fence. Been sheltering it. There's a big one roaming. Phone's out." Her eyes softened at the small head on the crate's rim. "You heading to town?" "I am." She ducked inside, returned with a thermos and clean towels. "For the little one," she said, tucking them in around the cub. "Tell Mabel to open the back room at the store. The vet's at his sister's, but he'll come if someone rings the clinic bell. Roads are ugly for trucks. Word travels faster than wheels in winter." By the time he pulled into town, people were outside the general store, breath white in the cold. Mabel shoved the door wide. "Bring him in," she called. "And stamp your boots, you old mule." The back room smelled of coffee. They set the sled beside a stack of feed and lifted the crate to a table. The cub blinked at the fluorescent light, then fixed on the steam from a kettle someone started. Mabel was already rummaging. "Goat milk powder, bottles, a heat pad for chicks, it'll do, scale, towels, rubber gloves." She spoke like a list that filled itself. The bell over the door jingled again and again. People came, looked, and softened. A high school boy ran to the clinic. 2 men shoveled the stoop. Mrs. Alvarez from the diner brought broth and bread. The room found its rhythm. The ranger arrived last, snow up to his knees, hat crusted white. He looked, then set his hand on the crate's rim. "Mail tracks out by your place?" he asked. The farmer nodded. "Big," he said. "Testing the yard." "All right," the ranger replied. "Rehab snowed in till tomorrow at best. We stabilize here, keep the cub warm and fed, limit handling, move at first plow. We'll keep watch tonight." Usually he keeps to himself, but we'll be ready. Something in the farmer's chest loosened. He looked around, Mabel sorting supplies, Mrs. Hargreave folding towels, the boy returning with the vet in his wake, and understood the gate he'd opened, others had walked through, and now it was a road. The vet washed his hands and leaned in. "Dehydrated, underweight, but bright," he said. "Good reflexes. Whoever kept him by a fire kept him alive." He touched the crate's edge and felt the warm exhale against his knuckle. Outside, a plow growled on Main, steel finding pavement. The town had decided, as towns sometimes do, that the smallest thing on the coldest day would be theirs to carry together. By late afternoon, the snow had stopped, leaving a pale sky that glowed faintly above the rooftops. The general store's back room had become a kind of makeshift care station. The cub, wrapped in warm towels, lay on the heat pad in its crate, eyes half closed but ears flicking at every sound. The farmer sat nearby on a wooden chair, his hands folded over his knees. He wasn't used to so many people in one place, not since the town meetings he used to avoid. But now, he found he didn't mind the low murmur of voices, the smell of coffee brewing on the counter, the shuffle of boots on the floorboards. The vet checked on the cub every hour, lifting it gently, weighing it, rubbing a little salve into the pads of its paws where the frostbite had started. "It'll heal," the vet said, looking at the farmer as though he'd done something rare. "You got to it just in time." The ranger stepped in and out, radio crackling on his hip. "Still no movement near your place," he reported once. "But the plow's going through now. Rehab will be ready by morning." As the evening settled in, the little community in the back room grew closer. Mrs. Alvarez brought in steaming mugs of broth and insisted the farmer eat. Mabel kept slipping extra towels under the cub, muttering about keeping it as snug as a biscuit in a blanket. Even the high school boy who had fetched the vet sat on the floor near the crate, sketching the cub in a small notebook. The farmer found himself telling the story, how he'd found it by the fence line, the ice in its fur, the way it hadn't tried to run. Each time he spoke, more people listened. And each time, the tightness in his chest eased just a little. Night fell early, as it does in deep winter. Outside, the streets emptied, the snowplow's growl fading into the hills. Inside, the back room stayed warm, the yellow light pooling over the crate. At one point, the farmer leaned forward and rested a hand on the rim. The cub stirred, opening its eyes. For a long moment, it looked at him, really looked, as if remembering the firelight, the quilt, the sound of his voice in the cabin. Then it shifted, pressing its small head against his fingers. A few people saw and went quiet, watching the scene unfold. The farmer didn't say anything, but he felt something catch in his throat. The ranger broke the silence. "We'll take turns tonight. 2 at a time, watching the back. If the big one comes near town, we'll know." He looked at the farmer. "You can rest. You've done your part." But the old man shook his head. "I'll stay," he said simply. So they made space for him, pulling a chair closer to the crate. Outside, the wind had shifted again, carrying the scent of the forest through the narrow gaps in the doorframe. The cub's nose twitched, and for a moment, the farmer wondered if it knew exactly what, or who, was out there. The hours passed slowly. Now and then, boots crunched on the snow outside as the watch changed. Inside, the fire in the store's potbelly stove burned low, casting long shadows over the walls. The farmer dozed once or twice but woke each time to the sound of the cub shifting in its crate. Each time, he leaned forward, murmuring a few low words until it settled again. Near dawn, the ranger came in, frost clinging to his beard. "Clear night," he said. "Nothing moving out there. Roads are open. We leave for rehab in an hour." The farmer nodded, though the thought of letting the cub go tightened something in his chest again. He reached into the crate, brushing his fingers along the soft fur between its ears. "You'll be all right," he said quietly. And for the first time since he'd found it, he almost believed it. The first pale light of morning spilled over the snow-covered rooftops, turning the edges of the frost to gold. In the back room of the general store, the cub stirred before anyone else, shifting under its towels, nose twitching as it caught the scent of cold air leaking in through the cracks. The farmer was already awake. He'd been sitting in the same chair most of the night, watching over the little animal like he had in his cabin. Now, as the ranger stepped in with 2 steaming mugs, the old man reached into the crate and gave the cub a slow, careful stroke between the ears. "Time to go," the ranger said quietly. The store buzzed with gentle activity. Mabel packed the formula, bottles, and blankets into a box. Mrs. Alvarez slipped in a jar of honey for the road. The vet gave last-minute instructions, his hands moving with practiced precision. Even the high school boy stood ready, holding the crate steady as the farmer bent to lift it. Outside, the morning was still, the snow crisp underfoot. The plow had carved a clean path down Main Street, the ice crunching softly under the tires of the waiting truck. The bed of the truck was lined with hay, a thick blanket spread over it, ready for the cub's ride to the rehab center. The farmer set the crate gently in place. The cub turned its head toward him, eyes following every movement as he tightened the straps. It made a soft, questioning sound, not distressed, but something close. "You'll have more room there," the farmer said quietly, leaning close. "Warmth, food, your own kind. That's what you need." But his hands stayed on the crate a moment longer than they needed to. The small group from the store stood gathered in the pale sunlight. No one spoke for a while, letting the moment stretch. Finally, the ranger gave a small nod to the driver. The truck's engine rumbled to life, exhaust curling into the cold air. The cub shifted, then pressed its head once more against the inside of the crate toward where the farmer's hand had been. The old man stepped back, his boots crunching in the snow. His breath came in a slow exhale, clouding in the air before him. As the truck pulled away, the farmer watched until it was just a dark shape on the white road, then smaller, then gone around the bend toward the open country. The others began to drift back toward their warm kitchens and stoves, but the farmer stayed where he was, looking at the road. He thought of the cub in the snow the first morning he'd found it, frozen, alone, and of the firelight in the cabin, the quiet nights, the sound of small paws on the floor. He knew he might never see it again. But he also knew the cub had a chance now, and that was more than it had before. Mabel came out and handed him a thermos. "You should head home before the next storm," she said. He nodded, taking the thermos, then started the walk back to his cabin. The road was quiet, the snow crisp under his boots. In the distance, the forest loomed, dark against the pale sky. When he reached his porch, the silence of the place felt heavier without the small sounds of the cub moving inside. He hung his coat, lit the fire, and set the kettle on, the way he always did. Later, sitting in his chair with the mug warming his hands, he let his gaze rest on the folded wool blanket by the stove. A faint smell of smoke and animal fur still clung to it. The cabin was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet it had been before. Now, it carried a memory, a reminder that sometimes, the smallest act of kindness could pull an entire town together, if only for a few days. And in some way, he realized, it had pulled him back into the world too. Outside, the wind picked up again, swirling snow across the yard. The farmer leaned back, listening to it, and for the first time in years, the sound felt less like loneliness and more like company.